Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a closer look at some similarities and differences between Amazfit's GTR 2 series versus the GTS 2 series, and after trying out both of these smartwatches for a while. So of course one of the biggest differences just by looking at them is related to the design, with the R standing for round having a circular display, which is AMOLED and measures 1.4 inches diagonally, versus the square screen of the GTS that measures 1.65 inches. So although the size here does seem to be larger in terms of the dimensions of the GTS, in reality the surface area of both screens are actually very similar, since the round here does have the same radius across the entire surface versus the square has almost a taller aspect ratio. So the screen is a bit more narrow, and as a result, the diagonal size, which is 1.65 inches, might seem a little larger, but really they are comparable. Both watches sell at the same price point and also feel almost identical when you're wearing them on your wrist, since they have very similar overall weight and dimensions. Both of them are very lightweight, constructed out of metal materials on the sides and also Gorilla Glass 3 on the front. The charging mechanism is exactly the same, and the sensors are also exactly the same. So we have access to the ability for heart rate monitoring, SpO2 blood oxygen monitoring, waterproof rating of 5 ATM, again the same AMOLED or OLED display technology being used, and the same OS from Amazfit that is powering both of these watches. Starting with perhaps the biggest difference after using it though would have to be the battery life, and that's simply because the cell that they've chosen for the GTR series is around 400 milliamp hours versus the GTS series for some reason is only around 250 milliamp hours. So almost half the size, which means the battery life is also about half of what you'll get on the round version of the watch. That means if you do want a endurance champion, something that you can wear and not have to worry about charging for ages, you'll find a slight benefit with the round watch in that regard. In fact, this one here can last you for around 2 to 3 weeks of regular use before you need to recharge it, versus on the square watch, it will only last you around 5 to 7 days. When it comes to the overall performance of both of these watches, they're also quite similar, although if we want to be 100% honest, the GTS does have an advantage of the refresh rate of the screen does seem to be ever so slightly more smooth. As you can see here, as we're swiping along, it does feel almost buttery as I'm making these transitions, and you can see here how everything just flows along versus the GTR watches, which although they do already feel quite responsive, maybe has a slight moment more of hesitation as I'm moving super quickly across pages, as you can see there. So it just feels ever so slightly more fluid on the GTS's refresh rate of the display that they've chosen. So that might be also one reason why, even though the battery life is better on the round watch, they have perhaps chosen to mitigate for the cost by adding slightly better display and slightly perhaps faster chipset onto the square version. However, I can honestly say that this difference is super minor, and as you're using the watch in isolation, you can't really tell the difference. You never will get really annoyed by either watch, and unless you're really comparing them side by side and looking at how fast each one of them takes to open up an app, you're not going to really notice a difference in practical use. One of the other design differences that we're talking about here is the GTR series has 2 crown keys compared to 1 on the GTS series, and that means for all of the commands you have to use only one key on this watch here, so tapping on it once to go into the list of applications, as well as doing things like perhaps double tapping to bring up the list of workouts and activities to track, versus this can be split into 2 separate keys on the round watch, which some folks might prefer. Having that extra hardware button also allows you to customize things a little bit more easily, but overall it's not too big of an issue. I found them both to be easy enough to get to the apps I wanted to. Again, the mode of interaction is exactly the same on both of these watches. So on the GTR, for example, we can drag down and take a look at things like turning on a flashlight, which will basically turn the entire displays white to allow you to illuminate a subject in the dark, go into the adjustment for the display brightness, and other things such as taking a look at your battery saving mode, and some other properties like a theater mode, which will disable sound, can also be accessed. Finally, in terms of notifications, both are exactly the same. That means you're able to look at messages and emails and tweets, but you aren't able to reply back to them on these watches. When it comes to the sports tracking, both of these watches are also pretty much giving me the same performance. They are using the same sensors inside, which is to say both of these are on the conservative side when it comes to tracking your steps and performance, which means if you take around 100 steps, I found both of these watches to typically count around 95 steps on the display. So it's going to be around 5% margin of error. And then the performance of things like the heart rate monitor is pretty much exactly the same on both, using the same sensors again. Same thing goes with sleep tracking, no discernible difference between the two. Both are very effective in the sense that they can track number of hours you've slept, deep sleep versus light sleep, how well you're breathing at night, and also tell you also naps that you're taking during the day. And these are all done automatically, really without any problems. Both of these watches, again, do have built-in GPS, which allows you to take a look at different runs and outdoor activities. You can actually view back and look at the path directly on the watch itself, which is pretty neat. You don't have to bring along your phone to track your location, and you can also take a look at other details as well during your sports session. The accuracy of the GPS chipset is exactly the same on both of these models, which is decent in terms of accuracy. As long as you're in an outdoor environment, you'll be able to see your session really without any problems, and it'll get a lock usually within about a minute of stepping outdoors. And so that does mean that, again, the overall number of sports that you can track on both are pretty much par and par even as well, including swimming. You can also track that on both of these watches. I do have to point out that there is another sub-variant of the GTS, which is called the GTS 2 Mini, that we also checked out, but there is no version of the GTR or Round that is called the GTR 2 Mini. So the only Mini version belongs in the GTS family, and this Mini edition, like we saw previously, just has a smaller screen, so about 1.55 inches this time around, but the functionality is again quite similar to these other smartwatches. It's just at a slightly smaller size and more reduced price point. All of these watches do have built-in microphones, which allows you to do some voice commands, and the standard editions of the watches also come with 4 gigs of built-in memory, which allows you to store music on it and listen to them back. You can even connect the watches to wireless headphones to listen to music directly. There is also a light version of both of these watches called the GTR 2E and the GTS 2E. Both of the 2Es have exactly the same dimensions as the regular versions of the smartwatches. The only difference is they lack the local 4 gigs of built-in storage, and they also don't have a speaker, so you can't use it to, say, play back music out loud. But aside from that, the overall functionality, the processing power, the number of sports that you can track, again, is identical. So that's more or less it as far as our comparison just between this current generation set of wearables from Amazfit. Both, at the end of the day, are super sleek, and you really can't go wrong with either, to be honest. Both feel comfortable on your wrist, and if all you need is a casual everyday smartwatch that looks great, shows you basic notifications at a glance, and lots of sports tracking, I think you'll be comfortable with either, just depending on your tastes in terms of the design. Again, one does have the benefit of better battery life, but at the same time, charging these is quite simple, and it just takes about an hour, so it's not too big of a deal. And at the same time, the benefit of the square version is having perhaps some slightly better optimization when displaying certain apps, since it can fill content up to a more traditional border compared to the round display, which looks great, but in certain applications does cut off some of the corners as you are interacting. And also the fact that this does have a slightly faster response rate to the fluidity of maybe the screen, but it is a very small difference. So be sure to check out more details of both in their separate reviews that we've posted if you are interested. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews, going over some of the differences and similarities between the GTR and the GTS series.